And Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi hosted US President Joe Biden at his residence in New Delhi. The high-stakes bilateral took place as soon as Biden landed in India for the New Delhi G20 Summit. According to the joint statement, President Biden lauded India's G20 presidency. The two leaders held discussions on a range of issues, including the importance of Quad initiative in the Indo-Pacific region. Well, US President Joe Biden reaffirmed his support for a reformed UN Security Council and India's bid for a permanent membership. The two leaders underscored the need to reform the multilateral institutions. They also reaffirmed the role of technology in defining the strategic partnership. The leaders re-emphasized that the shared values of freedom, democracy, human rights, inclusion and equal opportunities for everyone are extremely critical in today's time. The leaders reiterated their support for building resilient global semiconductor supply chains as well. While the leaders lauded the settlement of the last outstanding World Trade Organization dispute between the countries. Now, this is Biden's first presidential visit to India. Climate change has been a common topic of concern as well. There are bilateral interests like economic cooperation and multilateral investment opportunities. Well, over the years, New Delhi and Washington have found an isolated space of diplomacy. But even with changing geopolitics, the bilateral engagements have continued to foster. And this meeting in New Delhi is seen as an extension of just that. And for more on this, we're now being joined by VOA correspondent Jessica Stone. We're also being joined by Principal Diplomatic Correspondent Siddharth Sibal, who's joining us live from Bharat Mandapam, the venue of the G20 Summit. Welcome to the show, Jessica and Siddharth.
Good morning.
Right. My first question is for you, Jessica. Now, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and US President Joe Biden, they held an hour-long bilateral meeting yesterday where they spoke on a slew of issues, like I mentioned, from technology to defense cooperation. But Jessica, talk to us as to what is on Washington's agenda at the G20 Summit.
Well, I think a couple of things. Number one, Washington does want a mention of Ukraine and its position reflected in that final communique when it comes out on Sunday. So Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, has offered to work very closely with the Sherpas on getting to that conclusion and said yesterday to reporters when asked that she does believe it's possible to get there. Number two, I think there's a real agenda on the part of Washington to make the G20 legitimate. There's some doubt at home as to whether that's the case, and making it legitimate in particular for the needs of the global south is one way that Washington is selling the need for and the relevance of the G20. And I would add that that is a big part of why the World Bank reforms have been announced and the additional funding that Washington has asked for. The White House has asked for $3.3 billion from Congress to be added to the World Bank Fund. They've obviously chosen a new World Bank president that can reflect some of the reform efforts that are going on. Additional funds at the IMF as well are on the table. And then I would also say perhaps the third agenda item for the U.S. going forward through this G20 is to strengthen alternatives to Chinese lending. And that's something that's certainly shared by other members of the G20. But whether that's the part of the agenda behind the reforms at the World Bank or other multilateral lending institutions, that's a big part of the conversation, particularly because we don't have the president of China and the presidents of Russia attending.
Absolutely, Jessica. Coming to you, Siddharth, it is the weekend of diplomacy here in the national capital, New Delhi. You're joining us live from Bharat Mandapam at the venue of the G20 Summit. What is on the agenda today and what are the key points to look out for?
Well, I'm at Bharat Mandapam where we will see the leaders coming in almost 1 hour from now. And on the agenda are several things, whether it's climate change, the debt crisis, or forming consensus when it comes to global issues, especially on global governance architecture. But India will be keen that there is an Indian imprint on the global governance architecture, and India is also keen that the voice of the global south is amply reflected. In fact, under the Indian presidency of the G20 grouping, the maximum number of countries of the global south are represented at the high table, in fact the Delhi high table, and focus also on bringing African voices with the inclusion of African Union as a permanent invitee of this grouping. But largely, if we look at how India has been steering the discussion when it comes to joint statement, this is something that we will get to know finally when or if the joint statement is issued. There are several proposals now, including one that there should be a joint statement without the mention of Ukraine, which has been a contentious issue when it comes to the G7 led by the US and Russia and China on the other side.
Absolutely, Siddhant. A lot of things to look out from the course of the next 2 days. Coming back to you, Jessica, the point you made there of the absence of the Chinese and the Russian president, with both the leaders not attending the G20 Summit, do you think that the G20 Summit will be dominated by Western perspectives in the course of the next 2 days?
That is one way to look at it, but I think another way to look at it is that you'll see an increased position on the part of the remaining G20 attendees at looking for ways to counter Chinese influence throughout the world. So I was on a call with Washington officials or White House officials yesterday in which they talked about this corridor that's going to be announced today. There was some reporting over the last 24 hours indicating some sort of rail or port infrastructure deal between India, the Middle East, and Europe. And that was basically what they're indicating, is there will be some kind of announcement. Well, obviously, that is a very direct counter and answer to China's Belt and Road Initiative. In fact, it's very much in the same location as much of those initiatives. So I do think that the focus, whether it's on the economic side, countering China in the Indo-Pacific, or countering China's increased proximity now to Russia through what's going on in Ukraine and that axis that's been developing between China, Russia, and North Korea. I think that's a big part of what's going on behind the scenes in terms of the conversations here at the G20.
Absolutely, Jessica. Coming back to you, Siddhant, there will be a host of issues that will be discussed, like what we've been talking about here on WION. But Siddhant, talk to us regarding how New Delhi plans to unleash its soft power in the course of the next 2 days.
Well, I'm here at Bharat Mandapam, and there are many pavilions, including the cultural pavilion. There's, in fact, this cultural corridor. Also, the crafts being shown from various states of India. There is the digital exhibition as well, where India's payment revolution is being showcased. And India is using this opportunity to showcase to the world how it has excelled when it comes to the digital payments revolution. But all in all, the 3 C's, culture, cuisine, and crafts, are the focus area at Bharat Mandapam. But all in all, if you look at how India has taken its presidency, the year-long presidency that comes to an end in November, is to host various G20 meetings, ministerial meetings across the length and breadth of country, from Kashmir to down south Kerala to Gujarat to the northeast, including Arunachal Pradesh. So India also hasn't shied away from hosting meetings in Arunachal Pradesh and Ladakh, which of course have made the Chinese very not happy about the development. But all in all, if you look at how India has been focusing on its presidency, not only internationally to project itself, but domestically to showcase itself to the foreign delegates who have arrived all through the year and, of course, are reaching Delhi for the summit as well.
Absolutely, Siddhant. A lot of things to look out from the course of the next 2 days. Thank you, Jessica and Siddhant, for joining us on WION and sharing insights with us on this. Thanks very much. Well, as India gets set to host the G20 Summit in New Delhi for the next 2 days, WION caught up with Harsh Shringla, Chief Coordinator of India's G20 Presidency, on the significance of the event and how it reflects the aspirations of the global south. Take a look.
With me is India's G20 coordinator for the presidency, Harsh Shringla. So welcome to WION. Why this moment is important for India as India gears up for the big G20 summit?
Well, you're right. This is a critical moment for India because, from tomorrow we will be hosting the most momentous international event that we have done in our history. It is an opportunity not just for the government but for the people of India to present not only our narrative on the global agenda but also, the best aspects of our culture, our tourism, and every aspect of development in our country. And no doubt, how can we use our development model, human-centric development model, and put it across the world through the G20 medium. And here I think everybody, whether it's our partners from the developed world or the emerging economies, all are in agreement with us that we can use that model and we can work together collectively to address some of the global challenges of the day. I mean, today we have unprecedented challenges, and how can we address those challenges, I think, is a very critical issue.
How will India become the voice of the global south at and during this summit?
Well, to a large extent, India is already perceived to be a voice of the global south. We have articulated the concerns and priorities of the global south in our presidency. If you see our broad priorities in our presidency, they all are basically manifestations of what the global south desire. And I have no doubt that when you see the final outcomes, those will also reflect